Hello, we are finally live. I love it when technology works. So welcome everybody to another Leadership in 15 episode. And in this particular episode, we'll be talking about how you show up as a leader determines your culture. And as you can see, I'm joined by my lovely guest, Paul Snell. So without further ado, Paul, would you like to say hello to the audience and tell them a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jackie. Well, my name's Paul Snell. I've been a coach now, a professional coach for, goodness me, the last 12 years. But in the last couple of years, for me, my passion for behavioral science has taken over. I'm a firm believer that understanding how we behave, why we behave the way we do, and how we think can transform both leadership and businesses. So for me, this is where my focus and my passion sits.
And a lot of the things that you talk about, because I've been following you, we've been connected for a long time on LinkedIn, and a lot of things that you talk about I absolutely agree with, and I've learned a lot as well from the things that you share. So I'm really excited to have you on board, and we're going to try our best, although this is such an interesting topic. I'm sure to the audience, whether you're watching this right now live or whether you're watching it on recording, I can absolutely guarantee you're going to walk away with some really great ideas in terms of your own leadership and how you can support your leaders as well within your business. So I guess, Paul, to start with, would you say, that most people or most leaders in particular, if you ask them, do they know themselves well, that they would probably answer that they do because they get feedback from people, etc. They take on board that feedback. But do you think genuine self-awareness is perhaps a little bit harder to achieve than we realize?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, no doubt whatsoever. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? When we talk about self-awareness, we often sit and go, well, I know myself well. I've been through all of these, the self-help books. I've had various training and so forth. Tells me what to do to become more self-aware. But here's the challenge. You don't know what you don't know. So becoming truly self-aware is really challenging, right? It's really difficult. And let me perhaps explain that with a bit more science, if you like. There's some wonderful work done by a behavioral scientist called Daniel Kahneman, and he identified we have two ways of thinking. We have, of course, what he calls system one thinking, which is our instinctive, non-conscious thought, right? And what he describes that is a bit like a filter. When we have a decision to make or we need to respond to a situation that requires some processing of the mind, the first thing that our minds do is go to what we have got instinctively. That's a non-conscious mind. And what that means is all the experiences in life, all the things we've been told that have been reinforced over time and time again, they become a filter, and your brain says, those things must be true. Therefore, we're going to hold those down and we can automatically make decisions on those. We don't need to think about it, right? It becomes instinctive. And about 95% of our decisions we make daily are made that way. So 95% of the things you think about daily, you instinctively make the decision. That only leaves 5% where you actually think about it, right? This is system two thinking, is when you think about something. It forces your brain to process information at a conscious level. So here's the challenge. If 95% of our decisions that we make daily, or our responses that we make daily, are based on instinct, which is in fact all our beliefs, attitudes, and feelings, then the challenge is how do you become self-aware enough so that 95% becomes something you can work on? And this is the key, right? Self-awareness is much more than going, I recognize I might have a challenge with anger, for example. That's great. I'm not disputing that. I think that's great progress. But what it doesn't address is, where does that come from? Why am I thinking like that? Self-sabotage is a classic example. Why do I self-sabotage? We do it time and time again, and there's no explanation that we can come up with. So for me to answer that question is, I think there's a big chunk of the puzzle missing unless we start digging into that. Why do we behave the way we do from an instinctive level?
And that 95% that you talked about is something I share often in a lot of my training sessions, and people often look at me in surprise. Really, 95%? And I liken it to, have you ever been in a situation, I know I have, where I've had to explain something to somebody? That could be, something on my mobile phone, that could be, in terms of a process, that I've done time and time again on a system. And when somebody asks you a question, well, what do you do or how do you do it? You suddenly think, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just do it automatically until somebody starts to question it. I know I've found myself in that situation many times.
All the time, Jackie. Whenever I do a presentation to explain some of this, I use a photograph of a woman that's clearly is angry by her face. And I ask someone, I say, what do you think that woman's feeling? And they'll go, yeah, she's angry. And without question, she looks angry. Then I says, but how do you come to that conclusion? What about that face importantly says, oh, it's anger? And then there's silence. Because if you were asked to try and explain as a non-professional in behavioral science, what about a face and why that face is feeling angry, or that person's feeling angry, you really can't do it. You just know. Some people say, yeah, but I just know they are, Paul.
No, yeah.
Great. I'm really pleased, but there's why it's really important to understand how we think that way.
Absolutely. And before we go on to the next point, because I really want to dig into the sort of psychometric tools and assessments that many of us are familiar with. But if anybody's watching this right now, the only way we'll know that is if you say a quick hi to us in the comments, because LinkedIn doesn't give me that information. And of course, we welcome any questions as well as we going through this discussion. But as I say, many of us are familiar with psychometric tools and assessments. There's insights, for example. But where would you say, I guess, traditional personality assessments that often rely on what people say about themselves, how does implicit response testing provide a different perspective, and why should it matter for leaders?
Okay, so let me answer that a wee bit. Most psychometrics are what we call self-reporting. They ask you to answer or rate a bunch of statements that come up in front of your screen. I'm being very general there because there's lots of different ones, but they're largely self-reporting. In other words, they'll ask you, where do you rate yourself on a scale from 1 to 10 around this statement, around your personality? Or it will ask it in different ways and rate the response you give. That's self-reporting. What that means is your brain is thinking about that, right? It's processing that in the logic brain. That's a system 2 thinking I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The challenge with it is so much of who we are and how we show up exists in that non-conscious bit. So the way implicit response testing occurs is it measures that non-conscious, we'll call them bias. It's a non-conscious thoughts, feelings, and attitudes, right? And so in the easy way to describe it is we have 2 things. We have a rating for instinct and a rating for intent. Now, intent, which is the self-reporting bit, which is most psychometrics, is where we'd like to be. I would like to feel that I enjoy helping others. So I'm going to rate myself highly with that. So I enjoy helping others is a statement from a psychometric framework called the Big 5. And that's great. And of course, and I would be really surprised if leaders didn't say I like helping others. Right?
Absolutely.
The challenge then is, what does your non-conscious, your intuition or your instinct say? That's your implicit response. And what we look at is the gap between the two. And we call that a dissonance. And that gap is where there's contention. You have an intent and you have an instinct. And we want to work out or work through, why is there a gap? Where do the alignments exist? And more often than not, we begin to develop. Our brains are so clever. What happens is when we see that gap, our brains instantly start chucking up reasons why that might be the case. And they chuck it up from that non-conscious bit. I've had many occasions where someone sat there and gone, oh my goodness, I've just realized why that's happening. I mean, incredible situations where there is a statement that goes, I respect the opinions of others. And of course, instinct, our explicit response, our thought response is, Well, of course I do. Why wouldn't I? But our implicit, our instinct is the complete opposite end of the scale. And we've had occasions where someone's gone, oh, I now know why I can't possibly agree to that, agree to the fact that I value other people's opinions. One case where someone with a PhD degree realized at that point that having a PhD was the only way she would actually listen to another person's opinion. If they didn't have a PhD, she'd dismiss it. That was not a conscious consideration. That was entirely non-conscious. So if you can't look at the non-conscious, there's no way you could understand what was affecting the intent. You know, you just wouldn't even think about it. You dismiss the opportunity. It wouldn't get to the brain to go, oh, is that a good one or a bad one? It would just never get there for conscious thought. So it's the reason why implicit is so important, is it digs deeper than our intent.
Which is so, I know we're going to keep this to 15 minutes, but, you know, I'm already fascinated and thinking about how this could potentially, you know, affect myself. But in terms of examples that you've seen then, in terms of how you've increased a leader's self-awareness, in terms of that implicit preference, and how it's then resulted in changes, positive changes for that leader, and of course how that then translates into potentially improving the culture within an organization.
There's one scenario that stands out most, and you know, within this scenario there are many behaviors, but the scenario is this. In the world of psychometrics, we call stress and pressure being in the grip, right? And what we know about people and leaders of people, of course, is that when you're under pressure, when you're stressed, or when you're in the grip, your responses become even more automated. They become even more reliant upon the non-conscious. And the reason for that is we fall into fight or flight. We don't think that the logic brain has no time to consider when we're under pressure or stress. The pressure is to respond quickly. The pressure is to make decisions quickly. So what we know about human behavior is the more someone's under pressure and stress, the more they rely upon their instinct, their non-conscious feelings, thoughts, and beliefs. The challenge with that, as we go back, is the less we know about that, the less we will realize and appreciate how we're showing up and responding under pressure. The more we know about that, the more we will be able to adapt our behavior under pressure and stress. So you can imagine, can't you, if you have a scenario where a leader is being under pressure, becomes very aggressive or assertive or unreasonable, as far as they're concerned, they won't notice that behavior because that's instinctive, right? That's how their brain has learned to do things quickly in situations where there is pressure and stress. And of course, that has a direct impact on the team, on the outcomes, because we stop making good decisions, we start making poor decisions, we become affected by biases and all the non-conscious beliefs and understandings we have that have been reinforced over our lives. So let me give an example. A behavior that comes up quite a lot in a culture, in a work environment where teams and leaders, is something called an affinity bias. Without even thinking about it, we tend to gravitate to people that share common pastimes, common beliefs, common likes, what they look like, how they behave. We gravitate to them without any logical reason. It's just an instinctive response. The challenge with that is the team, and there's great stats around this. It's shown that if a person believes there is a clique or a group that's exclusive because, oh, well, they like motorbikes or, you know, they like golf, they're 2.5 times more likely to withhold any ideas or creativity or potential. That's how strong this can be. And that's just one small example that directly impacts, because you can imagine, can't you? If you're a business, you're relying upon that creativity, you're relying upon that ability to come up with ideas and develop the business. If that's withheld 2.5 times, if that's withheld, you are directly impacting the results of that business.
I'm just thinking, as you were just saying about, you know, how leaders sort of, you know, show up when they're stressed, etc. And I remember working with a senior leader who was actually managing the contact center at the time, and you probably come across this as well in your career, Paul, where you knew how that person was feeling just by their facial expression. She could never hide it. And you knew whether, when you walked into an office, whether to walk straight back out again, or whether to sit down comfortably in the chair and have a good conversation.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that is it's rarely that the person is rarely aware that they're doing it. That's the point I make about when you're under pressure or when you're under stress. We don't recognize the behavior that's default for us. And that's the level of self-awareness that directly impacts leadership and directly impacts a business. That's where the growth happens. And it doesn't matter how many courses, how much coaching you get, unless you understand why you behave the way you do, you can't possibly build on it.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. Look, I always like my guests to share one action, one thing that whoever's watching this live or on recording can take away that will have potentially an immediate impact on them. What would you say that one thing is?
There's a very good quote from a psychologist called Viktor Frankl. And he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. It's a very deep and often sad book about World War II and so forth. But he gave us more than one golden nugget. He gave us a golden nugget that I use all the time, and that's between stimulus and response, there's always time to think. We often think that when something happens, our response is immediate. It's rarely the case. If we can learn to, when something happens, stop, think before you respond. And let me tell you, it's not easy. So this is not a magical cure, but it's like a habit. The more you do it, the more it becomes default. The more it becomes easy to do, the more effective it becomes. So if you can start now between stimulus, the event, and response, your response, there is time to think. Practice that until it becomes a habit. And I can promise you faithfully, it will change the way you lead.
I absolutely love that. And I'm going to practice it. I'm sure some point today when my husband does something that irritates me, I will stop and pause and think before I respond.
There you go.
Oh, thank you ever so much, Paul. As I say, I know we've only sort of just touched the surface of the level of this, but it's such an interesting topic. And I'd love to have you back on again in the future so we could take an even deeper dive into this. But look, if there's anybody watching this right now and they're not connected to you on LinkedIn, Paul, or if there's another way that you'd like people to get in touch with you to find out a little bit more about the work that you do, what's the best way to contact you?
By far, it's LinkedIn. Just look for me. You can't miss the face. Just look for me. Now, there's not loads of us on there. You'll find me. Connect me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to sit and jump on a call and explain all of this in more detail so you understand where I'm coming from before we do anything else. Always happy to do that.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Paul, and I hope if you've been watching us live, that you've enjoyed it as well and found this of value. I know I certainly have. Look out, if you are sort of watching these on recording, look out for my next one next week. I'm not quite sure who my guest is yet, but there will be one ready for you all next week. But look, Paul, thank you ever so much for giving up your time to share your wisdom with us all today. And for those of you watching us, I hope you have a great rest of the week.